Thank you.
I call David Seymour.
Mr Speaker, I rise on behalf of the ACT Party in support of this motion. An honourable former member of this House once said to me to come and listen through the debate so that you can respond to earlier speakers, and I have to say I feel like Fletcher Tabato has let me down in that regard. But in all seriousness, we should tribute him for standing up and making a contribution to what is a very serious public policy debate that we do only get to address once every 5 years. And you'll forgive me, sir, if I at the very least respond to some of the remarks made by other members, whether or not you were attempting to rein them in from going off topic at the time.
Order. It would be unfair to leave the member without me interjecting, bearing in mind I interjected on everybody else. But they're not the rules of the Speaker, they're the rules of the House. It is a very narrow notice of motion, and if the member wants to debate the issue, such as the other members have, they've got general debates to do that in, they've got other abilities to be able to do that. In this particular debate, it's around a notice of motion. It is about the funding for the next 5 years, and that is all it is.
Understood.
I haven't yet sat a member down. Other speakers have.
Well, Mr Speaker, when we look at the agreement, it's interesting to note that the annual funding allowance rises by approximately 0.75% each year, less than the current target band for the Reserve Bank, and what an incentive that is for the efficient running of the bank. I think that when the House debates a motion as to whether or not we should be funding the bank and at what level, it is worth paying tribute to exactly the institution and its governing legislation, because we've heard some criticism of the way that it operates. I think we should be clear that around the world, our model has been tributed again and again. The Bank of Canada is modelled upon our bank. The first Reserve Bank governor to operate under this Act, Dr. Don Brash, was called Central Banker of the Year by The Economist magazine. He was also noted at length in the autobiography of Milton Friedman, who won his Nobel Prize for his work on monetary policy. So while the world admires so much of this bank that we are debating funding today, there is still some confusion about what it can achieve back home. And in response to earlier calls that perhaps it should be funded higher so it should do more, I would respond there are fundamental limits to what it can achieve. For example, there has been confusion around whether or not the Reserve Bank should have a mandate of trying to control the exchange rate inside or outside current legislation. I think it's important that the House is clear on our understanding that it is not possible by printing money faster or slower to change the real exchange rate. The Reserve Bank might well change the nominal exchange rate, but domestic inflation will mean that that nominal exchange rate change is meaningless to those who would purchase New Zealand goods offshore. There are those that say that the Reserve Bank should have more tools, and perhaps that would be a cause for greater funding as raised by other members. However, we know that economic stimulus is not something that central banks can do in the long term. Indeed, monetary policy can achieve but one objective, and that is price stability and certainty for people who wish to save and invest in a country such as New Zealand. And that is an objective that is well worth funding thoroughly, and something that I completely support today, sir. Indeed, central banks that do have the kind of divergent objections or more tools, as some members have mentioned, create terrible perverse incentives, and actually it would be bad expenditure to give them more money to do such things, because they lead to broader economic instability. Take, for example, the Federal Reserve, the Central Bank of the United States, which has multiple and conflicting objectives such as controlling employment. By reducing the price of cash in the early 2000s, it's increased the value of long-term durable assets, i.e. houses, led to a mortgage bubble that sunk the world into global turmoil from which we are still recovering. It would not be wise to give the Reserve Bank additional objectives other than price stability and financial stability. However, Nonetheless, as Grant Robertson noted, it is being forced into a position where it feels it must act on the Auckland housing market, and it was the contention of the member that actually the bank should be funded at a greater rate in order that it should play that role. And I would respond to the member that in actual fact, when you're in a hole, you should stop digging. We clearly have a regulatory failure. We have evidence from around the world that it is the price elasticity of supply of housing in markets such as Auckland, those that take on prescriptive and constraining land use regulation, that lead to inelastic supply, speculative investment, and a direct redirection of resources out of the other sectors of the economy for which the Reserve Bank, I suspect, would prefer to lower the interest rate and into the housing market. So rather than going further and further down the track of having a Reserve Bank funded to use, quote unquote, more tools to intervene further and faster into the housing market, we should be taking up the cudgel and fixing the regulatory environment and therefore the price elasticity of supply in that market. And wasn't it ironic, Mr. Speaker, that Russell Norman decided to go into the issue of how cities should grow? He said the only way to get supply was to build more apartments, and I feel it should be put on record in the House that he misrepresented the governor, and he also misrepresented his own party's position, because only, and I will finish this thought in 2 seconds, only weeks earlier one of his own colleagues had said that an expansion of the city at the fringes would be so rapid in its effect on supply that it would collapse the Auckland house price in the market. It also was referenced that perhaps the Reserve Bank, with more tools and greater funding, could do something to help with diversifying the economy, helping the tradable sector and boosting exports. I think when we fund this bank, we should consider the effects of our current monetary policy settings in our current bank on what exactly has been the history of the tradable sector in New Zealand. Well, Mr. Speaker, from 1988, with a year before the current Reserve Bank Act, right through to 1999, and resuming from 2001 through to 2004, merchandise exports of goods and services exceeded imports for New Zealand. Anybody who says that the Reserve Bank should be playing in that particular sandpit is not cognizant of the facts. But what happened next? And again, we can either be funding the Reserve Bank to use more tools and do more things, or we could monitor other aspects of our behaviour when we prioritise funding. What happened from 2005 on was an explosion of government expenditure, which put brakes on the tradable sector, put pressure on the Reserve Bank, and ultimately put us into a tradable goods deficit in New Zealand. It was very much a lolly
Back to the notice of motion.
The notice of motion, Mr. Speaker, is about funding a Reserve Bank with very robust policy settings that faces some other external challenges that would be better addressed through other policy settings. And with that in mind, I would like to support this motion as one that funds the Reserve Bank for its proper purpose, and I refute the idea that the Reserve Bank should be pursuing multiple and divergent objectives with greater funding, because those of us who have studied the history of monetary policy in the New Zealand economy know that that would be a great disservice to all New Zealanders. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Members, the question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. Call on Government Order of the Day number 2.